It was Liverpool, 1957. The streets were damp, narrow, and filled with the scent of coal smoke and salt from the nearby docks. The city was still carrying the scars of war, bombed-out buildings, weary faces, and a quiet longing for something brighter than the gray skies above. In one small house on Menlove Avenue, a boy named John Lennon scribbled in his notebook, his restless mind chasing after words that could become something more than ordinary. He wasn't just another teenager. There was a fire in him, rebellious, sarcastic, yet deeply poetic. The guitar resting against his bed wasn't just wood and strings. It was his escape route. Across town, a quiet, polite boy named Paul McCartney carried his father's old trumpet in one hand and a battered guitar in the other. He had a gift, an ear for melody that could turn even the simplest tune into something unforgettable. But behind his gentle smile, there was a deep ache. His mother had passed away not long ago, leaving a hole in his young heart that only music seemed capable of filling. Then there was George Harrison, the youngest of them all, shy, almost invisible in the crowd, yet with a fierce determination whenever his fingers touched the guitar strings. He practiced endlessly, chasing sound that seemed bigger than Liverpool itself. And in the background of these unfolding stories, another figure was waiting, Richard Starkey, or as the world would one day know him, Ringo Starr. At that moment, he was just a sickly boy, often confined to hospital beds, but learning rhythm by tapping on whatever surface he could find. He didn't know it yet, but those taps would echo across the world. Liverpool in the late 50s was no place for legends. It was a city of workers, sailors, and survivors. But in its smoke-filled pubs and makeshift dance halls, something was beginning to take root. Teenagers were turning away from old traditions and turning up the volume on guitars and drums. Skiffle bands were everywhere. Cheap instruments, borrowed chords, and the raw desired play. And it was here on a hot July afternoon that fate made its move. At a small church fair in Woolton, John Lennon's skiffle group, the Quarrymen, was scheduled to play. John, in his worn-out checkered shirt, strummed his guitar with a cocky grin, trying to look tougher than he felt. The crowd was small, mostly kids and parents, but in that crowd was a boy named Paul McCartney. Paul watched carefully. He saw John's confidence, his sharp wit, and the way he commanded attention. After the show, a mutual friend introduced them. Paul picked up a guitar and, without hesitation, played 20 Flight Rock. His fingers moved effortlessly, his voice steady, his rhythm flawless. John was stunned. For the first time, he saw someone who could match his fire with melody. That moment, on the churchyard grass of St. Peter's Parish, was the spark. Neither of them knew it yet, but history had shifted. Two boys, both scarred by loss, both hungry for something bigger than their city, had just collided. The foggy streets of Liverpool had given the world its first glimpse of a revolution. And this is where their journey begins. Loudspeaker before we continue. If you grew up with Beatles songs echoing through your youth, or if you're just discovering their story now, don't forget, right below this video, you'll see a red button that says subscribe. Tap it, and you'll never miss the stories that shaped not only music, but generations. Liverpool is changing. The narrow cobblestone streets, once filled with the rumble of horse carts and the clang of factory work, were now echoing with a new kind of sound. Electric guitars, amplifiers buzzing, and voices raised in songs that spoke of freedom. Young people wanted more than their parents' world of ration cards and war memories. They wanted noise, color, rebellion. And in the heart of that restless youth culture, hidden beneath the ground like a secret chamber, stood a place that would become legendary, the Cavern Club. The club wasn't glamorous. Far from it. You had to walk down a narrow staircase into a sweaty, brick-lined basement. The air was thick with smoke, dampness dripped from the ceiling, and the smell of beer and sweat clung to every corner. But when the music started, none of that mattered. It was here that John and Paul began to shape their band. George Harrison, though still just a teenager, had joined them. His guitar worked sharper every day. He played with a quiet intensity, letting his music speak louder than his shy personality. John, brash and witty, often mocked him, but deep down he admired the boy's precision. Paul, ever perfectionist, tightened the harmonies, pushing everyone towards something cleaner, something bigger. They weren't yet the Beatles, not the legends. not the icons. They were still experimenting with names, still trying to figure out who they were. But night after night, in the cavern's smoky haze, their music grew tighter, their bond stronger. The cavern wasn't just a stage. It was a crucible. The audience wasn't forgiving. If you played badly, they let you know. Bottles could be thrown, heckles shouted. But if you played well, if you truly moved them, then the energy in that underground room was electric, like a storm breaking loose. John loved that danger. We're either going to knock them dead or they'll knock us off stage, he'd say with a grin before each set. Paul would roll his eyes but secretly agreed. George, quietly tuning his guitar, felt the same adrenaline. And then there was a gap still waiting to be filled. The drums, the rhythm was the backbone, and they needed someone solid. For now, they rotated drummers, none quite right. Somewhere in Liverpool, Richard Starkey, Ringo, was still perfecting his craft, unaware that destiny was pulling him toward the smoky basement. The Cavern Club became their proving ground. Teenagers crammed shoulder to shoulder, screaming, clapping, stomping their feet. The sweat ran down the walls, but the music was louder than the discomfort. Night after night, these boys from Liverpool began to transform. It was in those shadows, under the dim yellow lights and dripping arches, that the raw stone of a band began to be carved into something unbreakable. They didn't yet know how far the music would carry them, but deep down, each of them felt it, that whisper that says, "You are meant for more." From the foggy streets of Liverpool to the underground fires of the cavern, the journey was accelerating. The world above had no idea that below their feet, a revolution was tuning its guitars. Opportunity doesn't always knock politely. Sometimes it barges in with a wild grin and a dangerous offer. For John, Paul, George, and their bandmates, that offer came in the form of Hamburg, a German port city alive with neon lights, smoke-filled clubs, and endless nights that promised both adventure and ruin. They were still boys from Liverpool, carrying cheap guitars, threadbare clothes, and a dream too big for the Cavern Club alone. When the chance to play in Hamburg came, they took it without hesitation. None of them realized it would change everything. Hamburg wasn't like home. It was rough, raw, and merciless. The Reeperbahn district, lined with strip clubs, sailor bars, and theaters, was alive until dawn. The Beatles, barely out of their teens, were thrown straight into that chaos. Their stage was off in a corner of a seedy club. The crowd a mix of drunk sailors, curious locals, and rowdy girls looking for fun. But Hamburg demanded more than polite sets of 3 songs. The boys had to play for hours. 6, sometimes 7 a night. Their fingers bled, their voices cracked, and their bodies ached. But slowly, painfully, they grew stronger. The stage taught them discipline. The relentless hours forged their stamina. John's would grew sharper, Paul's melody steadier, George's guitar fiercer. Even when exhaustion blurred their vision, they kept playing. The music was louder now, rougher, more dangerous. Because Hamburg itself was dangerous. They lived in cramped rooms behind a cinema, sleeping on dirty mattresses, surviving on cheap food. Yet even in the filth, there was laughter, pranks, and a kind of bond that only comes from shared struggle. It wasn't all triumph. There were fights, breakups, even deportations. At one point, George was sent back to Liverpool for being too young to work legally. Paul and their then drummer Pete Best were briefly arrested over a prank gone wrong, but each setback only hardened them. Hamburg also gave them something else: experience with real rock and roll crowds. Night after night, they learned how to control an audience, how to push energy higher, how to survive the chaos of live music. They weren't just another skiffle band anymore. They were becoming something sharper, something hungrier. And in that crucible of neon lights and sleepless nights, the Beatles began to emerge, not as a dream, but as a force. Years later, John would say, "We might have been born in Liverpool, but we grew up in Hamburg." And he was right. The world's greatest band didn't just rise in the foggy streets of England. It was hammered into shape on the wild, dangerous nights of Germany. Hamburg was the fire, and from it, the Beatles walked out harder, louder, and ready to ignite the world. When they returned from Hamburg, the transformation was undeniable. Liverpool didn't recognize them anymore. These weren't just four scruffy lads with guitars. These were hardened performers, battle-tested in the chaos of German nights. Their sound was sharper, louder, and electrifying. And in the crowded underground of the Cavern Club, word began to spread. Something was happening. Audiences who came out of curiosity found themselves swept away. John's biting wit, Paul's golden melodies, George's fierce riffs, and soon enough, Ringo's steady, infectious drumming created a force no one could ignore. Night after night, the crowds grew. Girls screamed, boys tried to imitate their style, and the cavern became a furnace of music and youth. But every revolution needs someone to believe in it. Enter Brian Epstein. He wasn't a musician. He was a well-dressed, soft-spoken record store manager. But when he saw them perform, something inside him clicked. He saw not just a band, but a phenomenon waiting to be unleashed. Brian polished their image, got them proper suits, set meetings, and knocked on doors that would have stayed closed forever without him. Then came the breakthrough. EMI's Parlophone Records. Producer George Martin, a man with classical training and sharp instincts, agreed to take a chance on them. The first sessions weren't perfect. John was sick during one recording, and Ringo, who had just joined as their permanent drummer, was still proving himself. But the spark was undeniable. When they released Love Me Do in 1962, the fuse was lit. By 1963, Britain was no longer the same. Radio waves carried their songs everywhere. Teenagers clutched records, plastered posters on their walls, and lined up outside concert halls hours before the doors opened. The press gave it a name, Beatlemania. It was unlike anything the country had ever seen. Wherever they went, they were chased, mobbed, screamed at. Their concerts turned into tidal waves of emotion. The audiences screamed so loud the band could barely hear themselves play. Police struggled to hold back the floods of fans. Parents shook their heads, calling it hysteria. But to the young, it was freedom, rebellion, and pure joy. The Beatles weren't just a band anymore. They were a cultural eruption. For boys from Liverpool had become symbols of an entire generation's hunger for something new. And yet, this was only the beginning. Britain couldn't contain them much longer. Across the Atlantic, a giant awaited, a country that had lost its innocence after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. America was grieving, restless, waiting for someone to believe in again. And soon, the Beatles would arrive on its shores, guitars in hand, ready to change not just music, but history itself. By early 1964, Britain already belonged to the Beatles. But across the Atlantic, America still felt like an untouchable giant. No British band had ever truly conquered it. Yet fate, timing, and music would align to change that forever. The United States was still mourning. Only months earlier, President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. The nation was heartbroken, anxious, and searching for something, anything, that could lift the weight of grief. And then, almost like a gift from fate, for young men from Liverpool arrived with guitars, haircuts that shocked parents, and songs that carried hope and joy. On February 7, 1964, the Beatles landed at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. What awaited them was unlike anything they, or the world, had ever seen. Thousands of fans, mostly teenage girls, filled the airport terminal, screaming, crying, pushing against police barricades. The sound was deafening, a wall of adoration that stunned even John, who tried to hide his nerves behind sarcasm. Paul smiled warmly, George looked wide-eyed, and Ringo waved with boyish charm. America had never welcomed foreigners like this before. 2 nights later, history was written. On February 9, 1964, the Beatles walked onto the stage of the Ed Sullivan Show. More than 73 million people were watching, nearly half the U.S. population at the time. Families gathered in living rooms. Children sat cross-legged on the floor. Parents folded their arms skeptically, and then the music began. All My Loving. Paul's voice was steady, smooth, irresistible. John's rhythm guitar drove the beat forward. George's solos sliced through the noise. And Ringo, perched high above, hammered the rhythm with an unstoppable grin. The screams from the studio audience nearly drowned them out, but it didn't matter. America was theirs. Overnight, the nation fell under their spell. Girls plastered their walls with Beatles posters. boys rushed to buy guitars, and hairdressers were suddenly flooded with requests for Beatle cuts. The British invasion had begun. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Concerts in Washington, D.C. and Carnegie Hall in New York turned into riots of joy. Reporters followed their every move, asking cheeky questions that John always answered with sharp wit. They weren't just musicians anymore. They were icons, ambassadors of a new era. But behind the laughter and screaming, something deeper was happening. For a generation of American teenagers who had grown up under the shadow of war and tragedy, the Beatles offered escape. Their music wasn't just sound. It was freedom. It was rebellion wrapped in melody. Hope hidden in harmony. When they boarded the plane back to Britain, they left behind a transformed America. The doors of the world had opened, and the Beatles were no longer just a band from Liverpool. They were now the voice of a generation, and the whole world was listening. By 1966, the Beatles were no longer just performers. They were prisoners of their own fame. Concert halls overflowed, stadiums shook with hysteria, but the music itself was getting lost in the screams. On stage, they could barely hear themselves play. John, Paul, George, and Ringo looked at each other and silently knew this couldn't go on forever. So they made a radical decision: no more touring. The Beatles would no longer chase audiences. Instead, they would build a new world inside the walls of a recording studio. And that decision would change music history forever. At the heart of it all was Abbey Road Studios in London. It wasn't glamorous, just a quiet white building on a suburban street. But inside, it became their laboratory, their sanctuary. Here, under the guidance of producer George Martin, the Beatles began to experiment like never before. Every sound, every instrument, every effect was fair game. Paul pushed melodies into new territories, always chasing beauty. John's imagination exploded into surreal lyrics and bold ideas. George, once the quiet boy with a guitar, found his voice through Indian music and spiritual exploration, bringing the sitar into Western rock. And Ringo, steady, inventive, often underestimated, became the heartbeat of their most daring tracks. The result was groundbreaking. Revolver stunned the world with its daring studio tricks and fearless creativity. And then came Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Not just an album, but a revolution. It was colorful, psychedelic, layered with sounds no one had ever heard before. It wasn't just rock and roll anymore. It was art. For the first time, music felt limitless. They spliced tapes backward, played with orchestras, used everyday noises as instruments. Abbey Road became less a studio and more a time machine, a dreamscape where anything was possible. But beyond the magic, there was also strain. Each Beatle was pulling in different directions. John was diving deep into avant-garde art and personal struggles. Paul became the driving force, holding the band together through sheer will. George, often overshadowed, grew frustrated, yearning for more space to express his brilliance. Even Ringo, loyal and patient, felt the weight of being caught in the middle. Still, in the late 60s, their music soared. From the tender beauty of Yesterday to the epic chaos of Day in the Life, they weren't just writing songs. They were shaping the soundtrack of a changing world. Young people protesting war, chasing love, and searching for meaning found their anthems in Beatles records. The studio had set them free, but it also revealed the cracks. The Beatles were becoming more than a band. They were legends, visionaries, and yet increasingly strangers to one another. And as the sun set on Abbey Road, another question began to rise. How long could even legends hold together before the weight of greatness pulled them apart? By the late 1960s, the magic was still there, but so were the shadows. The Beatles were no longer the four inseparable boys from Liverpool. They were men now, with families, lovers, ambitions, and demons pulling them in different directions. John, once the sharp-tongued leader, had fallen deeply into a new world with Yoko Ono. She wasn't just a partner. She was his muse, his escape, his rebellion against the machinery of fame. But her constant presence in the studio fractured the old balance. The other three felt the intrusion, even if John didn't care. Paul, ever perfectionist, tried desperately to keep the band together. He arrived at sessions early, full of ideas, driving the group forward. But his relentless control sometimes felt suffocating. John accused him of turning the Beatles into Paul McCartney and his backing band. The sting of those words lingered. George, once the quiet boy in the corner, had blossomed into a songwriter of staggering talent. His song, Something, Here Comes the Sun, were as powerful as anything Lennon or McCartney had written, but he was tired of being treated as a third Beatle. Waiting for scraps of space on albums dominated by John and Paul, resentment simmered, and more than once, he walked out of the studio altogether. Even Ringo, the steady heartbeat, the loyal friend, reached his breaking point. He left the band briefly during the recording of the White Album, drained by the tension and constant arguing. Though he returned, the fractured lines were now visible to the world. Their music reflected the chaos. The White Album was sprawling, brilliant, but fragmented, each Beatle chasing his own vision. The songs didn't always sound like they belonged to the same band, because in truth, the band itself was unraveling. Still, in the midst of turmoil, there were moments of brilliance that silenced everything else. On the rooftop of Apple Corps headquarters in January 1969, they gathered for what would become their last live performance. Cold wind whipped across the London skyline as John, Paul, George, and Ringo played together one final time in the open air. For a brief hour, the magic returned. They weren't fighting, they weren't legends. They were just four friends again, making music and laughing as they always had. But once the guitars were packed away, reality settled back in. Money disputes, creative control, legal battles. It was too much. The band that had once been a brotherhood was now a battlefield. They had given the world everything. Joy, revolution, the soundtrack of a generation. But behind the smiles and harmonies, the loneliness grew. Each Beatle stood at a crossroads, wondering if the dream that had carried them this far was already over. And soon, the answer would come. The year was 1970, and the dream was ending. For a decade, the Beatles had defined youth, rebellion, love, and change. But no empire lasts forever, not even one built on melodies and brotherhood. The final cracks came not from the outside, but from within. Business disputes poisoned the air. Managers, lawyers, and contracts tangled the band in endless arguments. Paul wanted control through his in-laws, the Eastmans. John, George, and Ringo chose Alan Klein, a sharp-tongued manager from New York. Every meeting felt like a courtroom battle, every session like a war zone. John was drifting further into his life with Yoko, craving independence and freedom. He once said in an interview, "The dream is over." For him, the Beatles had become a cage. Paul, devastated, fought to hold on to what they had built. But the harder he pulled, the more it slipped away. George's songwriting genius, long suppressed, demanded its own stage. Ringo, weary of being caught between them, simply wanted peace. The final blow came quietly. In April 1970, Paul McCartney announced publicly that he was leaving the band. Fans gasped, newspapers exploded, and for millions around the world, it felt like the earth had shifted. The Beatles, those four boys who had walked out of Liverpool into history, were no more. But endings can carry a strange kind of beauty. As the band dissolved, their legend crystallized. The albums remained: Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, Abbey Road, Let It Be, like monuments carved into the soul of music itself. Songs that had once been soundtracks to youth now became eternal anthems. In the years that followed, each Beatle walked his own road. John gave the world Imagine, a hymn for peace that still echoes across generations. Paul built wings and kept filling stadiums with new melodies. George released All Things Must Pass, a declaration of spiritual freedom. Ringo carried his charm into solo projects, drumming with friends across the industry. And yet, no matter how far they went apart, the shadow of the Beatles followed them, because the Beatles were never just a band. They were a moment in time, one that captured the energy, the hope, and the heartbreak of an entire generation. When John Lennon was tragically killed in 1980, the world mourned not only a man, but a piece of his collective soul. When George Harrison passed in 2001, fans again gathered, singing his songs in candlelight vigils. But the music lived on, still lives on. Today, decades later, their voices are still fresh. Their harmonies still lift hearts. Their story, four boys from the foggy streets of Liverpool who changed the world, reminds us that greatness doesn't come from perfection. It comes from courage, from vision, from believing in something bigger than yourself. The Beatles may have broken up, but their legacy never ended. They remain eternal. And if you close your eyes, you can still hear it. The echo of a guitar, the laughter for friends, and the promise of a world forever touched by their songs. Loudspeaker if you grew up with Beatles records spinning in your living room, or if you're discovering them for the first time now. Remember, these stories keep the music alive. Right below this video, there's a red button that says subscribe. Tap it and join us in keeping the legend of the Beatles alive for generations to come.